Okay, everybody, I think this is the last video update I'm going to do for your discussions. It's for June 25th and 26th discussions because we're at the end of the class and it's the second to last day of class, and you'll no longer be able to derive any benefit from the update. But I'm glad that I did this where it could have more face-to-face contact in an otherwise very remote, in multiple senses of the word, class. But this is the last one. So June 25th, about Fahrenheit 451. I was just going to, instead of critiquing or commenting on your responses, I was just going to provide my own response to the question. And for me, when I read Fahrenheit 451 and I thought about what its connection to the laboratory revolution might be, my thoughts were drawn to ideas of artificiality and control, about technological mediation between ourselves and reality. In the case of the laboratory, the laboratory revolution imparted far more technological mediation between ourselves and nature, whereas science in the Renaissance or even in the early modern period might have involved direct contact between humans and nature, going out and observing a beetle, going out and observing an eclipse, going to different parts of the globe and observing the transit of the eclipse or the transit of Venus across the sun or whatever with a telescope. You have this direct observation of nature with your own eyes, your own senses, or in some cases, technologically mediated apprehension of nature and natural phenomena, but only through very simple technological media. So looking through a telescope or a microscope is a very, very controlled, understandable, limited form of technological mediation. Even though there is a technology literally between your eye and the natural phenomenon you're observing, that technology is really only altering your perception of that nature in a very limited and controlled and easily understood way, magnifying it, for example. But by the time you get to the laboratory revolution, you have a form of technological mediation with nature in which basically all nature as experienced in the laboratory is a kind of artificial nature. It's not really nature as found in nature. It's a sort of a human model of nature. Even the mice that we experiment with in modern genetic studies and other physiological, anatomical, biological studies aren't themselves natural. We've genetically engineered them to have certain characteristics that to adapt them to be perfect for laboratory use, for consistency, for genetic controllability, for genetic understandability. We have complete knowledge of their genome, and that allows us to conduct experiments on them. So in that sense, it's a sort of artificial nature. And similarly, Fahrenheit 451 was about technological mediation between ourselves and reality, but between ourselves and our social political reality, not the natural reality that scientists are trying to apprehend, but the social or political reality of a human being living in society. The wife, her entire experience of reality is technologically mediated through her television screen. So that was what I was thinking about, is the connection between the laboratory revolution and Fahrenheit 451 is artificiality and technological mediation. I wasn't assigned to read Fahrenheit 451 in middle school or high school. As some of you remarked, I know it's a very common thing to be assigned in middle school or high school, but my wife and I read it together. Something we like to do is we before bed, we read novels out loud to each other before bed. And if you're reading that book, and this is a sort of magical quality of Fahrenheit 451, is it's a book, so you're reading about these people who have forsworn knowledge and forsworn book learning, and you're feeling very self-righteous and very good about yourself because while you're reading this story, you're reading it through a book, and you get to feel like, oh, I haven't sworn off books. I'm still upholding the culture of book learning, the learned culture of literacy. So you get the very act of reading the book causes the reader to feel very good about oneself. That led me to think how interesting it would be to experience Fahrenheit 451 not as a book, not through the medium of written literacy, but as a movie or a TV show. There have been at least two movie versions of it, made one in 1966 and one in 2018. I haven't seen either of them, but I imagine it'd be kind of interesting to be watching Fahrenheit 451 through a screen, and there'd be a sort of cruel irony there. But nowadays, we could also do a sort of interactive Fahrenheit 451 virtual reality video game, and that would be very dystopian, but very interesting to see the sort of philosophical effect that would have on people who played that game. Anyway, just a thought. I also wanted to comment on the immersiveness of high production quality professionally made movies and TV versus the real authentic feeling of social media posts, uh, low production quality, authentic feeling of like somebody on TikTok pointing their cell phone camera at themselves in their car with maybe poor lighting or poor microphone. Um, these are kind of two different approaches to invisibilizing the technological mediation and artificiality of the experiences. Both of these filmic productions, the high production value productions of professional TV and film, and the low budget production of social media, they're both technologically mediated experiences, and they're both artificial. There's no way to know, just like with any reality TV, that the people on TikTok or Instagram Reels or whatever are telling the truth, if the experience that they're conveying, if the story that they're telling is an authentic story that's authentic to their own personal experience, even when they're giving that impression. We have no reason to doubt them. I'm sure in most cases that they are, but we have no way of knowing. The point is that these are both technologically mediated and artificial experiences, but they use two different methods in order to try to erase, invisibilize, or get the audience to forget that they are artificial and technologically mediated. Professional film production does this by being immersive, being so realistic, being so sensorially and all-encompassing that you sort of forget that you're in a movie. And that's what the best movies do, is they immerse you, just like the best books. And they cause you to escape your own sensorial existence around you and be transported into a different realm, a different world, which they have built and constructed so realistically, so compellingly, so believably, that you forget that you're undergoing a technologically mediated and artificial experience. The social media posts do it differently, through that raw sort of cinema verite, for those of you who are familiar with the language of film and video studies, feeling of just me pointing a camera like I'm doing right now, or the people in their cars or whatever, what they're conveying to you is, I've just pointed a camera at myself. This is documentary filmmaking. I'm just showing you reality as it's being experienced. Just what my camera lens sees and just what my camera microphone hears. And so that's an alternate way to sort of to deny the artificiality, to reject the technological mediation of the experience, and try to get the audience to experience or to perceive like they're experiencing an authentic experience. So, just some thoughts about Fahrenheit 451, artificiality, technological mediation. Now, for the hypothetical, counterfactual situation of dropping the bomb on Japan in the war, this is a moral quandary. There is, of course, no right answer. It operates, as I said, inside of a counterfactual, which is a sort of fancy historian's way of saying what might have happened, what didn't happen, what could have happened. Let's speculate, let's contemplate, let's ruminate on all possible historical alternatives. Those can be fun thought experiments. They also sort of have a ceiling, a limit to the sort of analytical, intellectual utility that they provide, because we really don't and can't know anything about shoulda, coulda, wouldas in history. But they're fun to think about, and to a point, they can be a useful intellectual exercise. Some people suggested that we shouldn't drop the. First of all, I just want to say that I counted, and only 5 of you out of the 26 or so said that you would drop the bomb on a civilian population. So 20% or something said you would, and all 5 of those people were men. Not a single woman in the class said that she would consent to dropping the bomb on a civilian population in Japan, as the United States did. Some of the reasons that people gave for not wanting to drop the bomb on a civilian population is that is for reasons of diplomatic leverage, and from a moral standpoint. By not doing so, we would set a moral and historical precedent, since we were the first nation to possess such a power. The fact that begs the question: since we did drop the bomb on civilians, what does that say? What does that say about our moral standpoint vis-a-vis the world as a global superpower? Another thing, somebody said the USSR has demonstrated expansionist tendencies, so providing them with nuclear information could accelerate a future arms race or embolden aggressive behavior. The counter argument to that would be, but withholding nuclear information will also kickstart a nuclear arms race because it will force them to develop their own nuclear weapons and without having the knowledge of where we're developing, which is basically what ended up happening in history. We did withhold all information about how to develop nuclear weapons from the world, and that didn't stop the UK, France, the USSR, eventually India, Pakistan, China, Israel, North Korea, and Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And so much so that the Russians developed their first atomic weapon, their first nuclear fission weapon in 1949, just 4 years after we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it only took them 4 years. Then we developed the first hydrogen bomb, the first nuclear fusion warhead in 1952. It only took them 3 years to develop their first hydrogen bomb, and then they went way overboard. They developed more nuclear warheads than we did, and they developed something that they called Tsar Bomba, the largest thermonuclear weapon ever invented. And so that's the sort of argument for sharing information, is that when you withhold information and both sides are trying to engage in the philosophy of mutually assured destruction, so they're both trying to match each other's destructive capability, and in that parity achieve a sort of détente, a sort of icy chill that prevents either side from attacking the other. And the problem with that is you're trying to guess, in the absence of information, you're trying to guess what are the nuclear destructive capabilities of the other side, and you certainly don't want to underestimate. And so the tendency of both sides in this sort of psychological game theory experiment is to overestimate, because if you want to err on the side of overestimation. You want to make sure, under the rubric of the logic of mutually assured destruction, you want to assure that you can destroy them. What ended up happening in history is both sides, the United States and the USSR, everybody else ended up developing a pretty marginal number of nuclear warheads. The French and the British developed a lot, maybe enough to destroy another nuclear superpower, but the amount that they built are massively dwarfed by the amount of warheads developed by the Russians and the Americans. And what ended up happening is both of us ended up developing and constructing multiple times more warheads than we need to destroy the whole world. And so that's the argument in favor of information sharing. If we had been open and participated in some sort of international oversight agreement to monitor our nuclear stockpile, the Russians could have built exactly the same amount of nuclear destructive capability as we were doing, with confidence that that was going to be enough, because we were transparent about the amount we were building. So that's that argument. Also, the argument that the USSR demonstrated expansionist tendencies and therefore they're not to be trusted. Somebody else said the Soviets demonstrated them to be dishonest people, are pretty funny from a historical perspective. The United States has also been an expansionist imperialist power. In the middle of World War II, we had the Philippines taken from us by the Japanese expansion in the Pacific Ocean, and we had conquered the Philippines from the Spanish and taken it over as a colony in 1898, and we'd held on to it as a colony since then. Hawaii, the Pearl Harbor that many of you mentioned as evidence of the inherent aggressiveness of the Japanese Empire, was an American colony at the time, which we took from the Hawaiian aristocracy without asking. By what's something called gunboat diplomacy. We strolled a bunch of armed naval warships into Hawaii and said, oh, this belongs to us now. So, just be mindful of the historical context of what you're saying whenever you're declaring entire nations of people to be dishonest or aggressive or imperialistic and therefore undeserving of our cooperation, our sympathy. Anyway, someone said, I would use a smaller singular bomb on the largest isolated military weapons plant. This would still demonstrate the power of the U.S. while avoiding killing many innocent people. Many of you, this sentiment reflects something that many of you said, which is that you would only target a munitions plant. The assumption being that the civilians who work in those munitions plants are somehow less innocent than other Japanese people living in cities or whatever. it's rare that there are isolated factories. First of all, factories also always have to exist in network, as you probably learned from this course, in network infrastructural relationships with sources of supplies, sources of energy, and sources of workforce. And so the people have to live somewhere. So wherever there's a large factory, there's by definition a city there for the people to live. There are very, very rare examples of just a factory out in the middle of nowhere and the only 5,000 people who live there are the 5,000 people who work at the factory. Because where do those people go out to eat? Where do they get their shoes repaired from? There's always a city in and around a factory. And so there's that problem. There's also the moral quandary of assuming that people who work in the factories making emissions plants are less worthy of our sympathy or less worthy of our mercy, that they're more deserving of being killed during war. And this gets at the concept of total war, that the entire society is oriented toward the war machine, whether you're directly fighting or whether you're just in the manufacturing sector. And it's an important moral quandary. I mean, the United States, England, Japan, everyone just wantonly bombed cities all the time, full of civilians. We firebombed Tokyo. More people died in our firebombing of Tokyo, even though we used conventional incendiary weapons than atomic weapons, than in the bombings on either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. About 100,000 people died in the firebombing of Tokyo, and only 60 to 80,000 people died in each of the atomic bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But there was indiscriminate civilian bombing of basically every city. Slaughterhouse 5, the Kurt Vonnegut book, about his time as a POW in the German city of Dresden, where we firebombed that and killed basically everybody in there. In that city, 30 or 40,000 people. But the moral quandary is that, well, why are the people who make bombs somehow less deserving of our mercy than other people who are involved in the manufacturing effort of the country? I mean, soldiers are just as dependent upon boots as they are upon bullets. A soldier without boots is no more or less effective than a soldier without bullets. And so why are the people who happen to work in the munitions manufacturing plants more guilty or less deserving of our mercy than the people who work in the boot manufacturing plants? It's an important moral quandary to ask yourself, and it is the sort of basis for the conception of total war. So yeah, those are all the things I was thinking about, but this is a tough question, forcing you to choose to kill or not to kill tens of thousands of people. It's a painful thing to ask ourselves. It's unfortunate that we have to live in a world where everyone needs to ask themselves whether they're willing to balance the lives of these innocent civilians versus some other innocent civilians, of their soldiers versus our soldiers. This is the kind of moral calculus of total war that has been accentuated by the invention of atomic weapons, and it's been thrust upon all of us. It's unfortunate, but that's the world we live in. And I think it's an especially prescient conversation to be having in light of the fact that the United States just engaged in some light war with Iran, ostensibly under the premise that they were stopping Iran's nuclear capability. And so here we have the long tendrils of nuclear brinkmanship bearing their ugly heads again. And it will continue to do so. North Korea will continue to develop nuclear weapons. Iran will continue to develop nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan will continue to engage in their little nuclear feints with each other. And then there's always the Russian Federation and the United States. Well, on that cheery note, goodbye, good luck on your Unit 4 critical essays. I'm sorry this video ran to nearly 20 minutes. That wasn't my intention, but it was the last one, so let's go out with a bang. I'm still enjoying reading everything that you all have to say. You've been a great class thus far, and good luck again on your essays. Email me if you have any questions.